Really.
Okay, I was just seeing if, good morning. Look at this, we're live today.
That's better.
Okay, thanks guys. We're doing a little technical adjustment here just to make sure our auditory is working between Janelle and my side, and now I'm trying to figure out what to do with my hair and my headset. So good morning and welcome to this afternoon's presentation. We're going to be doing a hackathon working through difficult accommodations. Again, I am Dr. Elizabeth Watson, and I serve as the Interim Assistant Vice Chancellor and Dean of Students for the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I also have the privilege of having a couple of other roles across the system in the state, and I'll let Janelle and I do a little bit of storytelling after that, but I'm going to let her introduce herself, and then we'll share a little bit about ourselves, and then we're going to jump into the learning today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I am the Chief Human Resources Officer for the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I have had a long history of working with accommodations, not only for myself because of my hearing losses, because I've had over 40 ear surgeries to hear, so I'm very fortunate, but also as an employer and working with employees through the many variations that we have needed to work through. I also had the privilege of working with Senator Paul Simon in the state of Illinois as we were moving through and putting the Americans with Disabilities Act, on in the history books. So we're very fortunate, and Elizabeth and I have worked together with PACD, which is up in Madison. So we wear multiple hats, different hats in many different arenas. So I think we have a great presentation for you today. So feel free to ask any questions as we go through the program today. Thank you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, if you have a question, concern, interesting tidbit, or thing you want to share with us, please put that in the chat in your Zoom box on the right-hand corner. If you think we're doing something amazing, feel free to give us a thumbs up or a hand clap out on those reactions. We'll do our best to get to your questions. Just to frame a little bit about what we're doing today, as we've had this opportunity to talk about equity inclusion for individuals with disabilities, Janelle and I have gotten a series of what I would refer to as honest, complicated questions. We know that sometimes asking about accommodation and disability is awkward, uncomfortable. People may feel insecure. So we have given people some safe space to ask us some of those difficult questions. We kind of culled through those, came up with some scenarios that we're going to go through today. So I want to let you know that if you have additional questions, this is absolutely a safe space, a free space, and we understand that we're going to ask you to use person-first language, which is a person with a disability, but we also want to make this a space and a place where it's okay to make mistakes because we're all learning, and we want to say that anything that is brought up to us is done from the intent of learning. So just want to make sure we're setting some of those safe space places as we move through here. So we want to share a little bit about our journey because between Janelle and I, gosh, I really don't want to total the years. We have a good 50 plus years of experience between the two of us.
Started this when we were 10.
We did. We were 7 and 10 when we started this journey together, and now we're in our 30s with you. But part of our journey has been informed by some of our lived experiences, and some of it has been informed by our career choices, and then the paths that were put in front of us that we had the opportunity to take the road less traveled and maybe less paved. Moving forward, when we look at the work with individuals with disabilities, I feel like Janelle and I have had the privilege of paving some of this work that sits out there today. So Janelle and I have both talked about that we identify as individuals with disabilities. Mine is an auditory processing disorder. This is one of the areas Janelle and I connected with, is that we both had youth issues, developmental being born with. And for me, I had a series of chronic illnesses that impacted my hearing and caused nerve damage, but also functionally disrupted my hearing from about ages of 3 to 8. So that also created some delays in learning. The amount of reading and expressive language that is picked up through hearing and through secondary slang, context, and exposure was not something I had full exposure to. And so I always joke that Miss Russell, my elementary school principal in Texas, Miss Russell, she drove a white Corvette. She was never so thrilled as the day that I moved on to middle school. I think today I would have been one of those students called passed. I don't believe I actually earned my elementary school grades, but rather my teachers passed me so that I could move on to other environments to be enjoyed as the young, enthusiastic learner that I was demonstrating myself as. Janelle is politely smiling over there.
So let me jump in there because there are so many correlations to our history in that regard. Because I don't think I passed a grade until I was in 7th grade with Sister Marie Pierre. So I never wanted to share my report cards with my children. So again, my brother was dyslexic, who was just a year older than me, and he also had a stuttering problem. So the two of us for years went to Mount St. Clair Academy in Clinton, Iowa, so we could learn how to speak. And it was then that one of the nuns knew that I would never survive in the hearing world and taught me how to speak sign. So that was probably one of the best gifts I ever had. But again, I was a late bloomer, like what you said the other day, Dr. Watson. And, today they call me doctor. So, but I was the one that never paid any attention in class because I couldn't get anything out of it. So here we are today.
Here we are today, two doctors with alphabet soup after our names, individuals where early formal education was not necessarily productive or educational. But developed some good resiliency and persistent. We both had good supports around us. I had a mother who happened to be an elementary school English teacher, who at one point was my teacher, and we decided maybe we shouldn't be in the same classroom together and still remain mother and daughter. So, we had resources that helped us move through this. Back in a time when resources were very segregated, I was never identified with my disability until my adult years, when my husband kept saying, "Honey, you can't hear me." And here's the irony with auditory processing disorder. I have 97% of my hearing. What happened is during my hearing development, because my hearing was disrupted, the way my brain created patterns to processing sound, my brain just processes sound differently. So that was a really interesting learning curve. What I didn't know is it was influencing the choices I made in my life without understanding it, because having the resiliency to persist was what really was mine. So I started my career working with individuals with disabilities because I did learn sign language due to having a preschool friend when I was 3 years old, and became an interpreter for the sign language for the deaf in an educational setting in college at the age of 20, which is a little bit ridiculous, but that's what happened. Oops, it looks like my picture got a little bisected and I'm not, there we are. And we lost Janelle, so we'll get her back. I'm just gonna keep chatting. So we'll let Janelle come back and tell her story, but my professional pathway was that I'm a licensed counselor and a rehabilitation psychologist by training with clinical background, and had the privilege to transition into higher education about 14 years ago, and spent an extensive amount of time in my early counseling career working when the new Americans with Disabilities Act came out, and got to have this amazing opportunity to learn architectural guidelines and work on accommodations when they were brand new to the whole wide world, which was really exciting because we were innovators, we were groundbreakers, we were the pavers of the road, because accommodations prior to that didn't have to be implemented. And this is the 30th year celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is something of it is absolutely a civil rights act and a civil rights movement. And so that is what moved forward, requiring not just public entities, which there's another law called Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which said public entities needed to provide access. But then we had the Americans with Disabilities Act that said, no, you private businesses too need to be accessible, not only for your customers, but for your employees. So I'm going to transition over here. And again, when Janelle jumps back on, I promise we'll get a little more of her story. So I want to talk a little bit about our goals for today. We're going to do a quick review of accommodations, a quick review of law and policy. This is by no means meant to be a legal session today, but it is important to understand a bit of law and policy. We're going to talk a little bit about universal design, because if we're talking about accommodations, accommodations are things we do after the fact or during the fact. And universal design means that people can work or engage and learn in your space and place before we need to have an accommodation. And then we're going to get to some of those examples. And just a reminder, some of the language in here is a little direct and is not necessarily what we would term as politically correct, but we wanted to have a safe space in place. And Janelle, we're so glad we have you back.
Yes.
Yay!
Who knows what happened?
So I just kind of wrapped up and started transitioning to our goals and let them know that as we move through the slides, some of our influences, whether it's working in industry or higher education or our lived experience, will bleed through absolutely in how we approach this work. So what is an accommodation? And I'm gonna pause and see, Janelle, if you want to jump in on this slide and walk us through kind of these critical acts.
Well, and what is an accommodation? I think people panic when someone requests an accommodation. And one of my very first interviews into higher ed, I was in a room and I had 27 people in that.
Oh my goodness!
And I was being interviewed, but the way they had set up the room was not conducive for me, for someone who has a hearing loss. So I actually, in the middle of 5 minutes into the interview, we had to restructure the room so I could see everyone, because it's important to know your audience. So talk about, showing the vulnerability. But, and it's interesting because sometimes it's just really simple. It may be simple tasks. In that regard, it's just simply moving the chairs so they would be in the purview of what I needed to see. But, an accommodation, we've been doing this since 1973, but so much so, and some people forget about Section 503. We can talk about that a little bit later.
Absolutely.
But many of us work with Section 504, especially for hearing and visually impaired and accessibility. But the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 really brought it full circle. So it says, that it really, for someone who has any type of a disability that substantially limits your day-to-day function, mental or physical, that here you go. This is here to help you. And it's interesting because it's about access. It's that simple. It's about access. And then it has been amended, so it was broadened in 2008, which was really nice. But here we are in 2020, and people still get confused. But it can be as simple as just reviewing a job description, identifying the task. Is it something different? Is it something minor that we can tweak? It might be able to be an opportunity to provide parking at your place of employment. Maybe simple as that. We might need to change the presentation for the visually impaired, adjust minor equipment tweaks to your computer, the screen, the keyboard, just simple things. Often, it's really, it's not difficult. And sometimes it's really helpful to provide a flexible work schedule. I was working with the BRT, with the engineers, for the bus route transit system and how they make their turns and how they need to be more productive in their efficiency of driving. But there was someone there in a wheelchair, and from where the bus was planning to stop, it was just a simple process of moving that bus stop just a half a block further, so that way the those with wheelchairs had that little ramp. Something so simple, but no one had identified that there wasn't a ramp at that stop, but a half a block further, closer to Madison College, there was a ramp. So, sometimes it's just really simple. And when we're going through these accommodations, there's no wrong questions. It's just a simple opportunity to ask questions. And, in your area, some of you may be out of state. Look at your state laws. I know that when it comes to driving, the CDL, the brake endorsements, there's monocular vision, and sometimes that doesn't work with a CDL in some states. So when they're crossing over state lines, it's really important to have an idea of what the laws are in the close proximity. Here in Wisconsin, we have the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act. So all of these things help provide access. But when you're looking at the position descriptions, please make sure that you evaluate what works in your area. And we are in Whitewater, so we are very close to the Wisconsin border and Illinois border. So it's important for us to know both states. Maybe as simple, in some of these accommodations, it may be just as simple for the supervisor, instead of verbally discussing something, may want to just do a simple brief synopsis to the employee because maybe there's some hearing deficiency. But if you have any questions, if we leave you with nothing else today, there is a job accommodation network. It's called Ask Jan. It's a great resource for employers. So it's www.askjan.org. So that's a nice resource if you have any questions. So, and that has been a resource that even I have used because it was a unique anomaly that I wasn't familiar with. Surprised as that may be, but.
Oh, and I love that. Ask Jan. What's the driving force behind that is the woman who developed that has a daughter with a disability, and she realized that employers were consistently having problems, and so the Jobs Accommodation Network, Jan, was developed. The woman behind that was advocating for her daughter to get employment and got kind of tired of answering questions for her job, and she's like, man, if one company has these questions, everybody's got to have it. And so she's been federally funded through a technical center, and it's the Jobs Accommodation Network, and then it's Ask Jan. So you're right, Janelle, just like an excellent resource for everyone.
It's free.
And it's absolutely free, and it is kind of a compilation of all the living learned experience compiled into that with the technical information as well.
Yeah, pretty cool stuff.
So as Janelle kind of anchored into, we get a little kerfuffled when we hear accommodation and we start thinking law. Yeah, there's laws that guide this. There's best practices that guide this. But I think what Janelle's really going to emphasize, and what I take away from her moment here, is that it really is a conversation. It really is that moment of listening and learning from somebody. So, as Janelle said, we're really functioning on removing barriers to equal access. She talked about needing to rearrange that room so she would have equal access to that interview process. And the barrier can be physical, but we also include, it could be policy, it could be process, it can be environmental. And again, back to Janelle's point, this needs to be an interactive process with the person with a disability. These are not processes that need to be done to or for somebody, but with somebody. Now, when we're doing universal design, we're trying to design really, really broadly and engage across the whole thing. But one of the things is looking at how we engage. And I think Janelle is going to be able to share with us as we go through this some excellent examples of how she has engaged individuals with disabilities in partnerships with their supervisor. So Janelle, this is one of our favorite questions. What is reasonable? And you and I say this all the time, just about anything. Because often people come to you asking you for what they think they need without understanding why they need it. And go ahead, Janelle.
So can we go back to the previous slide for just a moment?
Yeah, right here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Purpose and process, but I also want to highlight that so often it's the manager or the supervisor that's part of that interviewing process. And sometimes, the candidate will disclose what the need is. Sometimes they don't. But there's one role for the supervisor or the manager, and I think it's really important, and that is to support the employee. And when we're looking at, the barriers, and we're looking at, and some people feel that there are all these barriers out there, but it's really helpful. There's really, I kind of look at it as 7 steps, but analyze the specific job description and look at the essential functions of the job. So it's important. I have only in my career, in 30 years, I started again when I was 7. So, but in my years in human resources, I will say that only twice have we failed to not be able to provide an accommodation for the employee. And trust me, I've had hundreds to 1,000 of requests for accommodations. But look at the job description and look at what is the essential function for that job. There have been, I've only had 2 instances where it just didn't work. And then, make sure that you have the medical information that supports that accommodation request, because not always do they support what the need is. So make sure there is that connection. Talk with the employee and ask them, what they feel may be the challenges in the workplace. Most likely they have encountered it before or somewhere and will be able to share that with you, and explore with the employee, explore the potential options. And so now we're up to 5, assess the effectiveness. So it doesn't start just today, that maybe 30 days from now you check back. In 3 months, check back. In 6 months, check back. So that way we can also show that we have done a good faith effort. So, and then make sure that you communicate with that person regularly, and then document those conversations. So it really is very effective by working and interacting well with the employee or candidate. Again, I mentioned, in only twice have I experienced that we could not meet the accommodation. In one, and I will share with you, because one, the individual had monocular vision. And in order to go across state line, which was required as a semi-driver, he had to have both eyes that worked for day and night vision. So that was, unfortunately, that did not work. And then in another situation, it was really sad. It was actually a good friend of mine who had Lou Gehrig's disease, and she really wanted to stay working longer, and she could not do the essential functions of the job. And those are sad and difficult conversations, but only twice has that happened in my 30-some years of providing accommodations.
Janelle, thank you so much. That is just such a really comprehensive understanding of that interactive process, that it's not at one point, but it is a continuum and a continuous process. It's a 360 process where we go back, we check in, we evaluate. I think Janelle and I, a lot of my work has been accommodations in academic settings where a student says, I need X, I need a note taker. And we start saying, well, why do you need a note taker? Oh, I don't know how to take notes. Well, that's a problem. Right? A note taker doesn't supplement knowing how to take notes. It's a tool for taking notes. It's a style of taking notes. But boy, oh my goodness, you need to know how to take notes, because you're going to do this the rest of your life. And I need to really be working with you to figure out, what do you think note taking is? Right? Well, I put it down on a piece of paper. Well, actually, with technology today, it doesn't have to be on a piece of paper. There are so many other tools that would allow you to be your own independent note taker. So that's where this interactive process is so critical, and working with your colleagues and your experts and the people who think outside of the box, because you're going to find really elegant and simple solutions in ways and places you never found them. And one of the things Janelle and I have talked about is most accommodations cost under $50, and I cannot tell you what I've done with a piece of PVC pipe, duct tape, and some Velcro. I've raised a lot of furniture using PVC pipes or pipe fitters. And then there are just very few exceptions where where Janelle was talking about her colleague with Lou Gehrig's disease who could no longer do the functions of the job, which fundamentally altered the job or changed it, or an undue burden. I'm just going to put undue burden out there. I don't think anybody's won that federal case in a really long time, Janelle.
And that's true. And what's an undue burden? I was in, we discussed this previously, so I apologize if someone heard it before, but you know, I was called to work with this community, and they were going to redo, in terms of hiring this one particular employee who was in a wheelchair. They were going to redo, and so gracious of them, they were going to redo all of their water fountains in their community buildings, and they were looking at a cost of well over $1 million. And this person was never going to be in some of those other facilities. So, and I talked to the employee, and the employee says, I'm perfectly capable of using a Dixie cup by the water fountain. It was less than $5 fix. So sometimes people panic a little bit about what they're going to do.
I can tell you one of the few academic accommodations I never approved was when a student wanted their own personal elevator added to a building. We did work with the state of Wisconsin to determine having your own personal elevator at the location of your choice would be constituted as an undue burden.
That probably qualifies.
It did. The person wanted the elevator adjacent to where they wanted to park. Didn't build them their own elevator. Got to be honest with you. That one got away from me. So let's talk about universal design. Janelle and I are incredibly passionate about universal design. The more we think about inclusive design, whether it's your physical space, your policies, your institutional, your enterprise practices, your customer orientation, the more you can shift to universal design and the principles of ease of access, ease of use, intuitiveness, interactiveness. These are all built off the principles of our colleagues at the University of North Carolina. They started off originally grounded in concepts of architectural design. And over the last 20 years, universal design has become infused not only within educational curriculum and learning, but also into policy and practice. And again, if you've had the chance to talk, to listen in on any of Minnie or Tipper's work, universal design is just kind of embedded in those practices. When you look at IDEO design and design through inclusiveness, it's all on this principle of broadening. So it's moving from this idea of an accommodation, which is a unique practice for an individual. And then you even shift on the spectrum from access, which is things work for most people in some format, to universally designing, meaning it feels welcoming for all. And I want to talk about universal design also in terms of the construct that when a space feels welcoming to all culturally, your sense of belonging grows. You feel that you identify as an employee, a customer, a learner, an engaged person, a community member, when that space intuitively or when that business or practice works for you. And again, when you improve your universal design and your access and your accommodations, you improve your bottom line. You retain your employees longer.
And Elizabeth, I
customers.
loved your explanation the other day. So I am sorry, I am having some difficulty hearing, but sure. So if I overstepped you, I'm sorry. But you gave a wonderful explanation about what Surrey is, and that's a universal design, but we see it every day. We see it at the movie theaters because now you ramp into the movie theater. I mean, no one ever thinks of that. But remember the old movie theaters where you had to step down, step down, step down. You know, the curb cutouts, you know, the little yellow dots that, you know, allow people to know when you're at a street side. You know, that's all elements. So we've really moved away from inclusive design over to universal design, which is, you know, let's maximize this for everybody. Make it easier for everyone.
When I was a younger person as a mom with 3 small children, I was never so thankful for every curb cut with that stroller
Right.
that existed. And those curb cuts were not put in for me as a mom with 3 kids under the age of 6. They were put in because Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act said you will
Right.
create physical access because they're public ways. And they were put in for wheelchairs. Again, as a young mom, was never so thankful as the day that a door opener was there. And I didn't have to put a screaming toddler down, because that would be my kids, the screamers, to get a door open. Right? So there are so many things that we take for granted now in the environments that we work in. And the example that Janelle, Dr. Crowley is referring to is, if you've ever spoken to your phone or had your phone speak to you, thank a person with a disability. Because
Right.
the technology that's embedded into it, and if you've ever texted somebody, thank a person who's deaf. Because when cell phones were developed, there was a federal law that stated that there had to be this Telecommunications Act, that if a person's deaf, they have to be able to use that product. More importantly, they have to be able to call for emergency help, 911. And how do you do that when you're deaf on a cell phone and you can dial it, but there's no means to communicate it? So embedded texting was developed. And then we started having those snappy little, if we go back into the day, with pagers that had the flip up and that you could text. And so the pager was separated from the phone, and Motorola said, we can shove that technology in our phone. And then we all had to learn how to type on a keyboard that had only 10 keys, and so the alphabet 1 was A, B, and C, and if you were like me, you always missed the letter that you needed. So we spent hours, and that's why text coding language got very truncated, because none of us could type with 10 things in our thumbs. That's completely different now. But then it's evolved, and so some of the, 97% of the American population has a cell phone. 97%. And this little device, some of the biggest leaps and bounds in the technology inside of it that we take for granted every day, were originally federally mandated as access. And they're some of the most popular features. If you talk to Alexa or Google or whoever, what other device you have in your home, again, say thank you to a person with a disability. A lot of that technology was built off the architectural infrastructure of that. So those are examples of where things that were originally perceived as burdensome, oh, we have to make this accessible. If we view those as universal design, if we look at those customer service-based needs, look at all those customers now. All of my friends who are legally blind are loyal to Apple upside down in no ways, because the iPhone got better at interface design for people who are legally blind, blind with a big B, blind, or low vision with multi-tap touch taps and screen sensitive. So how hard I press my thumb on my screen dictates what I do. And they have brand loyalty in that community because they moved ahead with it. But then the pinch screen and the touch screen and all of those features now have been integrated into those technologies. So if you ever want to meet some really cool people, meet the chief accessibility officers of Google, Facebook, Apple, and I am forgetting one, Microsoft. Jenny LaFleur, who is the chief accessibility officer of Microsoft, she is deaf. And boy, man, you talk about an advocate who is looking at their product to grow their market share, because they know we're in an aging society, and she does not want to lose a single Microsoft customer. So universal design.
Talk about a return on your investment.
Yeah, millions and millions of dollars on return on investment. So that gets us to, why do we do this, man? Woman, friend, colleague, pets, fur babies. We do this because we have great employees. We have great customers. We want to continue with workforce development because we know individuals with disabilities are the most unemployed or underemployed workforce in this nation, which means you as an employer are missing out on some of your potentially best employees and broadest customer bases. And businesses that diversify have a better bottom line. If you go to Disability and National website, and I'll make sure we share this out again as a resource. Accenture did an extensive study that showed that businesses and corporations, predominantly corporations, large-scale multinational corporations, that diversify their workforces have better bottom lines, better
And it's
employee
interesting,
loyalty.
Dr. Watson, because I did a little bit of research on this as we were preparing for today. And for every dollar that is spent for an accommodation, you have $28.69 for a return.
That is fantastic.
How about that?
That
How
is a
about
return
that?
on investment. There you go.
Yes.
So I'm going to transition us. I'm looking at our time. We've got about 25 minutes left in our time, and I want to get into some of these examples. We may not get through all of them. Janelle and I will tag team what we're doing, but I hope you hear our passion, enthusiasm, and a dedication to problem solving in that interactive process. So the first one, which is one that Janelle and I have talked about this a lot, whether it's in an educational setting or an employment setting. The question came to us: I have a deaf candidate for a job interview who uses sign languages. None of us really know how to sign, and interpreters are expensive. What can we do to accommodate and improve our communication? So I'm gonna tap over to Janelle on this, because this is really kind of starting at that interview process.
Okay, well, it's interesting because my first language was sign language, so I have been called upon to sign. My problem is I don't hear well enough to interpret, so I can speak sign. Sometimes it's, they love it. They just love it when you try, number one. They just love it. So that speaks volumes. It creates an inclusive environment. But also, we have on our cell phones, and mine is getting charged up. But with our cell phones, I actually do have an interpretive. So I just dial a number and I can have a live interpreter right along with me. Sometimes it's simple as voice to text. So that's helpful. So, and sometimes everything is laid out, especially in my world, in the human resources and diversity world. So we do have everything that is drafted in a form or a document so we can share that. So that it's sometimes just a matter of simply yes or no questions as well. So you can do that on paper. So there are just really many mechanisms that can be used. So it doesn't have to, if you're nervous, just say, slow down. Let's write it down. They know what that means. So, just work through it slowly. I mean, just like you would want someone, if you were having difficulty with something, as recent as this week, I was having difficulty with communication. So someone was working with me and doing it a little bit slower probably than usual, because we do have a delay on the computer. So it's just taking our time and walking through it. And sometimes the actual candidate will make it easier. Sometimes they are very, very good. Some of the lip readers do a phenomenal job and really don't need much assistance. It's just a nice backup. So just make sure that you communicate with that person, ask them, and you can write a simple question. They typically know how to read. So, but I will say some people make assumptions. Just because someone has a loss of hearing, it doesn't mean that they don't understand. So I think I still laugh because I asked for a cup of coffee one day, and the person who brought it at the restaurant came and set the cup of coffee on the table and said, "Hot, hot." He's screaming at me.
Yeah, I think Janelle, if there's one lesson you take away, screaming at somebody doesn't change deafness. And I appreciate your sense of humor through your lived experience with that. And I go back to that first statement that you made, which is, first you need to ask the person, do you need an accommodation for this interview? You may know the person identifies as deaf and uses sign language. I personally use sign language in certain settings. So if I'm in a very, very large presentation where amplification may not be good because of my auditory processing, and if sound is disrupted in that, and I can give a great example with my colleagues when I was at a conference, I said, all I need is an FM system. right? Just because I need to make sure that the sound gets more direct to me, but we're going to be in this huge arena and there's no guarantee I'll be able to process it. So all I need is an FM system. And I got there and they said, we got you a sign language interpreter. And I said, why? And they said, well, you said that you needed an FM system, so we thought you were deaf. And I said, well, that was a huge assumption. It would have been great. You know what would have solved this problem? It's an email. So regardless, this company then proceeded to pay for interpreters for the whole event for me. It worked well because sign language is my second language, and I do rely on it in a number of settings. And any of my colleagues who were with me at that particular conference, it did get us front row seats for everything. And
I was going to say, we have to look at the, out of lemons, we create lemonade, right?
Yep. And the keynote speaker was President Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey. And Sir Richard Burton, Virgin Airlines, Sir Richard Branson and Ashton Kutcher, and some really cool people that I never would have been within 10 feet of, including Secret Service.
I met Christopher Reeves, I met Hillary Clinton, I met Madeleine Albright.
Right. So again, finding the lemons in the lemonade. But I think what you're hearing Janelle and I say is that this is a great example, but there's a little bit of assumption happening in here. So there's two pieces. One, which is find out if they need an interpreter. That just get through the interview, find out if they're an otherwise qualified candidate. If they ask for a sign language interpreter, all state agencies have registrations of of interpreters. And then if this is your most qualified candidate, move through the process and determine what you need. And I love this. How do we improve our communication? Janelle gave so many great examples of using technology. In the Center for Students with Disabilities, our interpreters are constantly teaching the team sign language, so we all know how to say hi and thank you and my name is, because there's an expectation that it's the courtesy greeting. And then the other one that we all know is like, sorry, my sign language is bad. I don't understand. This is the other one. I don't understand. Can you write that down? Right. So we teach what we call survival sign language, which is that polite apology of, I am sorry I don't speak your language, but here are some tools that will help us communicate. So really fun stuff, and kind of part of our pathways that we get to giggle about some of our lived experiences and front row seatings that paid off. So situation B, we have an employee with an ongoing health issue and sometimes misses work, but has also asked for an environmental review. We're not sure what an environmental review is and what are the possible outcomes, and is this even an accommodation? So I think, Janelle, you and I are going to have to do some guesswork on this one, but I think, Janelle, when you hear somebody say we need an environmental review, oh, we have a great question. Why don't we do this one, and then I'm going to tag into the guest question that comes up. So, so ongoing health issues, sometimes misses work, but asked for an environmental review.
So this actually can go in a number of directions, quite honestly. It can be the air quality. Maybe that person has an asthma issue. It can be the desk setup. It could be the chair that they're using. It could be the keyboard that they're using. It could be the phone that they're using. Maybe they have a problem with their neck. Maybe they need a headset. Simple fix. So it really, I have been asked to do an environmental review. One of them, even where we are now, was an air quality. One of them, actually, we did find a problem in a corner of the office. So, and that had to do with something that wasn't necessarily air quality, it had to do with the mold. So we had to do a remediation in that area. Many times it's a chair. One of the most difficult challenges I had was finding the right chair for an employee. That was it took us about 4 or 5 different tries before we were able to identify the right chair. She was a small person.
Oh, yep.
And, trying to get that so she had arm support, leg support at the right depth and length. So this can be a multitude of things, but just because we're doing an environmental review doesn't mean it's going to cost a lot of money.
Sure.
So that's really, really important.
I like too how you define that the environment could be a variety of things, and I think that goes back to that interactive process, ask the employee. So you're right, it could be air quality, it could be lighting, it could be the physical layout, it could be the computer system that they're being asked to operate with. They think it's environmental, but it really may be their computer screen, right?
And I
So,
was going to say, just the computer screen, we have different types of covers to screens that prevent shadowing, that prevents lighting, that really draws down the brightness. So there's a lot of different things. Something can set off a migraine.
good
So
one.
it can be any number of things, but it really takes, typically 5 minutes to review. And, usually they know what the barrier is or what the challenge is. And we are results oriented. We just have to come up with a solution. Quite often the employer candidate knows what the solution should be.
Yeah, I think again we need to always kind of listen to that lived experience and how that's going to inform the work. I'm going to jump in here. We have a question. How do you balance a request when the employer doesn't necessarily agree with what the employee is requesting? And it's kind of the parenthetical here is getting past the you just need to try harder, be better assumptions. So Janelle, we've had this kind of come up where, did you miss the question?
I did, because something just jumped in on my computer.
Okay, let me repeat the question. I could just tell from the look on your face. How do you balance a request when the employer doesn't necessarily agree with what the employee is requesting, and getting past the you just need to try harder, be better as an employee assumption?
Wow. See, and whoever asked that question, that's very correct. Someone is making an assumption. But I always look at, okay, let's talk to the employee. And sometimes I've been in a situation where I also did not agree with my supervisor, and or I did not agree with the attorney.
Ooh, good one.
But looking at, coming up with at least 3 different options is not a problem. And it's a win-win situation. The employee really does need to be part of that interactive dialogue. And that's where the supervisor is so important. It is so important for that supervisor to understand and to find out what the challenge is in the workplace. Can it be accommodated by anything? What is an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation? But sometimes a reasonable accommodation is that, $75 chair.
Right.
Okay. But maybe, for example, I provided that example with the small person, that chair wasn't suitable because there are different needs. So we had to have something that lowers the armrest.
Right.
We had to have something that pulls it in. We had to have a shorter seat. Yes, that chair was $375. Wonderful employee, well worth the investment. So it really is, in talking to the supervisor, to the decision makers, sometimes it's a financial thing, but we need to do that. If the person can meet the essential functions of the job, we need to do that. So compliance is a big issue.
I'm really glad you came back to that because, I guess, this is a written question, so Janelle and I are kind of trying to read between the lines or get there. And one of the processes that I know that you engage in frequently is walking through the job description and reevaluating what are the essential job functions. My favorite essential job function that I don't understand in 97% of job descriptions is must be an effective written and oral communicator. And the job is the person is putting fasteners together. So, Janelle, you and I have talked about that a lot of times a job description is written off of a template, or it was evolved over time based on a particular employee's skill set, and that person leaves, and so the job kind of reflects how a person used to do work or tasks versus what is the work and tasks that need to be done. So a lot of times when I see an employer and employee not agreeing, it's that facilitated discussion with an amazing person in HR who can kind of revisit, let's go through the job description. Let's go look through those essential functions, and then let's prioritize those and let's evaluate, and then let's look at where the accommodation fits into this process. So I think, I think there are so many moving pieces in this question, and Janelle, the HR team is such a critical element in this. So I'm going to tap back over to you because we were talking about essential functions and that job description here.
I think it's really important to look at the job description, but you will see a movement for that very reason, written and verbal. Well, okay, what does that really mean? It really means the ability to communicate effectively.
Right.
That's all I'm looking for. So you will now see a trend that is happening in the human resources world, that we're creating very generic job description templates. They're very generic. And we worked on a project recently in the past year about the
Yeah.
title and total comp project. So you're seeing a more generic approach into that conversation. If that person needs to be able to speak in front of 500,000 people, that's a whole different ballgame. But I've
Yeah.
seen people do it effectively who actually can't speak.
Absolutely.
So, so I think it's really important to really think out of the box, and again, what's the essential function? The essential function there is the ability to communicate.
Right.
So we all have that option to communicate differently. So what is that?
And I think that you bring up that really good point here, that I, as a supervisor, another good question. I'll read this moment. Another good point on that is, I always joke, if everybody just did it Elizabeth's way, my world would be so much easier. And I, as a supervisor, my job is to build a team that can do the work in front of them in compliance with the policies and procedures that are there. But recognizing that when you have a team of 16 or 24 or now 200 and plus employees who report to me, they're going to approach their work differently through their own strengths, through their own lens. And maybe they don't do it exactly the way Elizabeth would do, but what I need to do is look at that final product, and does it meet the deliverable? I need to look at how the person moved through that process, and did they follow the policies and procedures, or did they collaborate in the way that they needed to collaborate to get the outcome? So again, I think, Janelle, you and I have seen this many times where a job description comes and it's kind of a written history of the person who did the work before, but not the functionality of the work. Or a supervisor is saying, I want it done ABC. Well, when actually X, Z, Y would work, it's just not how the supervisor would do it. And some of those are just really good, honest conversations to have between an employee and a supervisor, and sometimes bringing in somebody from HR who can help both sides see you're both moving towards this win-win. You're just kind of approaching it differently. I'm going to pause here really quick and read this other question. I have 2 employees with screen lighting issues, and one brought in a filter for their monitor and fixed it, their own issue, but the other one is making the request through HR. If we make an accommodation for one employee, does that mean we're responsible for reimbursing the other employee? Otherwise, doesn't that penalize the employee who took care of it on their own? Who should be expected to bear the cost of different equipment? Well, the truth be told, in that case, and I'm going to be really transparent with you, today I'm wearing glasses that have the blue lens on it. I do wear prescription, and I opted to personally pay to have the blue, whatever the new thing, the Blue Z, Blu-ray, because we're doing so much on computers today and I was getting a headache. But because we've transitioned to remote, right? Most of us weren't doing so much. We were all using computers, but boy, are we using computers today, right? So I do know in cases like this, like Janelle, you said, there's many screen filters. The question is, did that employee who needed a screen filter have a disability, or was this kind of a personal preference? We all get eye fatigue. We all fade when working on a computer. Now in universal design, that's just an opt-in question. Hey, Janelle, we're using the computer a lot more. Do we have any filters, or can we buy this one through company ABC? They're about $20. Is that something I can have? Some of that is just good ergonomics, good safety, because I know, Janelle, you're a proponent of safety, and we don't want to do that. And in some cases, it may actually be related to a disability. So the first question is it disability related? Is it a functional impairment, or is it a preference? And so there's kind of three prongs to that, is looking at the ergonomics and the safety of it. The other one is looking at it through the accommodation lens as a person with a functional limitation. And then the other one is just being a positive employer and wanting your employees to have their best environments. And do you choose to be proactive in those things? And I would opt that Janelle's all three of those. So I would say in this case, if you had an employee who fixed and accommodated on their own at their own cost, you should probably maybe talk to HR about reimbursing that employee for that cost. Janelle, I'm going to tap over to you.
And thank you, Elizabeth. And I think that goes along with being a good employer and being a supervisor who recognizes, this employee did it on their own. So, for example, because of COVID, right? Some of us are working from home, and I have a computer that I put on a speaker, so it provides me with more sound. Hearing aids are wonderful. Sometimes they only do so much. So I have a speaker that helps me hear better. I didn't ask for anything. That was just for my convenience. That's simply for my convenience. So, but I think it's okay to ask the employee. If you bring in the invoice, we're happy to reimburse you. I mean, what's $20? Really?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a quick phone call to the ADA coordinator at your industry or your institution. And for here at UW-Whitewater, it would be our lovely colleague, Connie Putland, but to check out and see what can and can't be done. These are really great questions. I really want people to be encouraged. This is a learning process. So if you as a supervisor have two employees who are doing things differently and you're like, oh my gosh, Elizabeth just brought her own screen in and Janelle looked over and went, oh, I need one of those because of this. It is awesome that you as a supervisor are noticing an inequity. And
and I think it's important to note that when someone sees a unique accommodation that would really help them in their job, maybe they didn't know. For me personally, I went years and years and years without any assistive devices for my ears. The technology did not change until 2012 for it to help me. So I was at a golf course at a dinner, and someone had a similar process that I had gone through. And we're signing to each other, we're laughing so hard, and everybody's like, what's going on? Because she was sharing the new technology. Wow, I didn't even know about it at that time. So I was new out of the gate because of that assistance. So sometimes, until we see someone else or see the changes in technology, we don't even know what's available.
Right, and the employee that brought that screen in to fix it, maybe you need to replace that for them so they can take it home and put it back on their personal computer, right? So kudos to the person who noticed this and noticed the inequity. And as a supervisor, I say that's a question that you circle back on HR and say, look, here we are, and how do we maintain this equity? So great question, and a great way to do collaborative learning, right? We only learn when we see what each other see, hear, engage, touch, experience what others are doing. That's how we all learn how we could do something better or different too. So I'm looking at our time, Janelle. Wow, we are down to 12 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
Our time just went so quickly. We have a couple of other situations, but I'm going to skip really quickly. I'm going to remind people that October is Federal National Disability Employment Awareness Month. This is something we should all be celebrating. You can go to the Department of Labor, DOL, departmentoflabor.gov, and you can get these posters for free. It was great for you to put these up as a supervisor employer, that you are showing people with disabilities, sharing persons with disabilities, employing and supporting, that these are your customers. This is one of those public ways of showing your equity and inclusion. And then I want to really quickly, on the end of this slide, these slides will be published at the end of the presentation on our WIL website. You can go back and visit that. That's where you are if you're on our chat. There's the Jobs Accommodation Network that Janelle talked about, Jan, and it has the Ask Jan feature. If you are a supervisor, an employee, an HR, a student in the HR field, this is such an amazing resource for you. If you're a community leader, again, everything there. In our region, there's the Great Lakes Disability and Business Technical Assistance Center. Phenomenal resource, free. There are more regional TACs. If you need to know one, email us. We'll help you find it. ada.gov, that simple. The Employer Assistance and Resource Network in Disability, often called EARN, this website. The United States Access Board, that's physical access. W3C Web Accessibility Initiatives, this is the nonprofit agency that monitors accessibility on the World Wide Web and has best person first language. This is just a link. Again, sometimes those first small changes, changing your signage in your business or your industry, if you, instead of saying if you have a disability and need accommodation, if you say if you're a person and need access, that alone can change how somebody says, yes, I'm going to ask that question. And then universal design. I also have a bit of housekeeping I want to wrap up for those who are staying on the line with us, that our next session is this afternoon. Back with us. We have a break until 1:30. John DeGraff will be presenting on innovation. Super excited. He will be in the main room. And then we have a team that's going to be presenting on cultivating your talent pipeline, led by Georgianne Marziaka. That'll be in room 2. So we have a break here for everybody to grab a snack, a bite, a beverage. Janelle, it's clearly we have more opportunity to share, learn, and educate. I hope people have a tool that they walked away from today. So thankful to co-present with you. And I'll tap over to you to let you do your closing.
And I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me. It's been a privilege, and I look forward to collaborating more in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, folks, so much. Thank you for joining with us on a Friday, even though that sunshine is out on my neck of the woods right over here. But hope everybody has a fantastic Friday. We'd love to see you back at 1:30 for those last 2 breakout sessions, and then again at 2:45 for closing session, for recognition and some words from Chancellor Watson. Thank you.
Thank you.